The year is 1838. The American South is quiet before dawn, the kind of quiet that presses down on the land like a held breath. A plantation house sits at the center of it all. White columns, wide porches, windows dark and still. From the outside, everything looks orderly, peaceful even. This is how the world is meant to see it. Respectable, controlled, safe. But inside that house, something has already begun to unravel. A decision has been made that cannot be taken back. And by the end of the day, the illusion of control will shatter. Her name was Abigail Turner. History would remember her in fragments, court records, whispered accusations, a few cold lines written by men who never knew her. They would call her a poisoner, a criminal, a danger. What they would not record was her voice. What they would not preserve was her fear, or her desperation, or the long chain of events that led a woman with no legal identity, no protection, and no freedom to make a choice so final that it echoed across an entire plantation. This is not a story about evil in the way it is often told. This is a story about power and what happens when one person has all of it, and another has none. On plantations like this one, time moved according to a rigid rhythm. Bells rang before sunrise. Labor began in the dark. Every hour belonged to someone else. For enslaved women, the work never truly ended. Fields by day, kitchens by night, bodies exhausted beyond measure, yet still expected to obey, still expected to endure, still expected to remain invisible. Abigail Turner lived within that world. A world where survival required silence, where resistance, even in the smallest form, carried unbearable risk. A world where pain was routine and hope was dangerous. And yet something happened. Something broke through the silence. Because poison is not a loud weapon. It does not announce itself. It works slowly, quietly. It slips into places where screams cannot go. Poison does not challenge power face to face, it undermines it. And that is what made it so terrifying to the people who ruled this world. When members of a plantation family fell violently ill, suspicion moved quickly. Fear spread faster than truth. Eyes turned toward the enslaved quarters, toward the kitchen, toward the hands that prepared the food, toward the woman who moved through the house but did not belong to it. Abigail Turner became the center of that fear. But before judgment hardened, before accusations crystallized into certainty, there was a long road that led here, a road paved with coercion, threat, and a system that left no room for mercy. To understand why Abigail Turner did what she did, we have to step backward into the daily reality of plantation life, into the position of an enslaved woman whose body and labor were treated as property, into a world where the law existed only to protect those at the top. This story unfolds slowly because it has to, because desperation does not arrive all at once. It builds. It accumulates. It tightens its grip over years, not moments. Imagine living in a place where saying no is not an option, where refusing an order could mean punishment, separation, or death, where the law would never hear your side of the story, where even your children could be taken from you at a moment's notice. Imagine knowing that nothing you do will ever be enough. For enslaved women, the plantation house was often more dangerous than the fields. Kitchens were places of heat and constant surveillance. Mistakes were punished. Trust was never real. And yet, these women were expected to feed the very people who owned them, to nourish the bodies that enforced their captivity. Food was power, and power, even in the smallest amount, was rare. That is why poison terrified slaveholding society. Because it suggested something they refused to believe, that the people they claimed to control completely still possessed agency. That even the most oppressed could find a way to strike back. When word spread that a plantation family had been poisoned, it was not just fear of death that shook the community. It was fear of rebellion. Fear that the system itself was vulnerable. Fear that the silence they depended on could break at any moment. Abigail Turner stood at the center of that fear, whether she wanted to or not. Was it revenge? Was it survival? Was it an act of resistance, or an act born from unbearable pressure? The records do not tell us everything. But they tell us enough to understand that this was not a simple crime. It was the product of a world built on domination, where violence was constant, even when it was unseen. As the investigation began, Abigail's life was no longer her own. It never had been, but now, even the illusion of anonymity was gone. Her name was spoken in rooms where she was not allowed to stand. Her fate debated by men who viewed her less as a person than as a problem to be solved. And yet, behind the accusations and legal language, there was a woman who had lived every day under threat. A woman whose options had been stripped away one by one. A woman who reached a point where the future offered nothing but more of the same. This is where our story begins. Not with the poison itself, but with the world that made such an act possible. With the pressures that closed in around Abigail Turner long before 1838. With the question that history often avoids, what does desperation look like when escape is impossible? Because once the poison was discovered, there was no turning back. The consequences would be swift and unforgiving. And Abigail Turner would be forced to face a system designed to crush her one final time. Abigail Turner did not enter the world with choices. She was born into a system that decided her future before she could speak her own name. In the early decades of the 19th century, enslavement was not just an institution, it was an environment. It shaped the air people breathed, the laws they lived under, and the limits of what they could imagine for themselves. For Abigail, freedom was not something lost. It was something never offered. Plantations in the 1830s were designed to function like machines. Every person had a role, every hour a purpose. The white family at the center of the plantation lived surrounded by signs of comfort, polished furniture, fine clothes, steady meals, while the enslaved population existed to maintain that comfort at any cost. The system depended on exhaustion. It depended on fear. And it depended on the belief that resistance was futile. Abigail grew up watching this system operate with mechanical precision. She would have learned early that survival required obedience, and that even obedience offered no guarantees. Punishment did not always follow disobedience. Sometimes it followed inconvenience. Sometimes it followed nothing at all. The rules were not written to protect her, they were written to control her. As a young enslaved woman, Abigail's body itself became part of her labor. Enslaved women were expected to work as hard as men in the fields when needed, and then return to domestic labor afterward. Cooking, cleaning, laundering, childcare. Their exhaustion was considered irrelevant. Their pain, invisible. And, beyond the physical labor, was the constant vulnerability. Enslaved women lived under the threat of violence that was both overt and unspoken. They had no legal protection against abuse. No authority to appeal to. No right to refuse. Their silence was enforced by law and custom alike. Abigail learned, as so many did, how to move carefully through this world. How to read moods. How to anticipate danger. How to remain unnoticed when possible. These were survival skills, passed down quietly, never written, never acknowledged. The plantation house loomed large in her daily life. To outsiders, it symbolized wealth and order. To the enslaved, it represented surveillance. Every step inside was monitored. Every mistake magnified. A spilled cup, a late meal, a missing ingredient. Each could trigger punishment far beyond the offense itself. For enslaved women assigned to domestic work, the house offered no refuge. It was a place where they were always visible, yet never seen as human. Their presence was required, their voices unwelcome. They existed in a constant state of tension, navigating expectations that shifted without warning. Abigail's days followed a pattern that allowed little rest. She woke before sunrise. She worked until her body ached. She slept when allowed. Her future stretched ahead of her in an unbroken line of labor and submission. Marriage, if permitted, offered no protection. Motherhood brought fear rather than joy, the fear of losing children to sale or punishment. And yet, even within this brutal system, enslaved people formed bonds. They shared knowledge. They warned one another. They found ways, however small, to assert their humanity. A shared glance, a whispered word, a moment of laughter stolen from the night. These moments mattered. They reminded people like Abigail that they were not alone, that the system had not erased everything. Still, hope was dangerous. To hope was to imagine a future different from the one enforced by law. And imagining such a future could lead to despair when reality intruded. Many learned to suppress it entirely. As Abigail grew older, her role on the plantation likely changed. Domestic assignments brought her closer to the white family's daily routines. She learned their habits, their preferences, their vulnerabilities. She learned when the house was most quiet, when tempers flared, when control slipped, even briefly. This proximity did not mean trust. It meant exposure. The closer an enslaved woman worked to the family, the more vulnerable she became. Accusations could arise without evidence. Punishments could be inflicted without witnesses willing to speak. The law was not neutral in this world. Courts existed to protect property. Enslaved people were property. Their testimony held no weight against white voices. Their guilt was often assumed before questions were asked. Abigail would have known this. Everyone did. Which is why the events of 1838 did not emerge from a moment of sudden madness. They emerged from years of pressure. From a lifetime spent inside a system that offered no legal path to justice, no safe avenue for escape, no mercy. When historians look back, they often ask why enslaved people did not rebel more openly. But rebellion did not always look like open revolt. Sometimes it looked like endurance. Sometimes it looked like subtle resistance. And sometimes, in moments of unbearable desperation, it looked like a single act meant to change everything, or end it. Abigail Turner stood at the edge of such a moment. She lived in a world that demanded her silence, her labor, her body, and her obedience. A world that punished her existence while denying her humanity. And slowly, relentlessly, that world narrowed her options until only one remained. The poison did not appear out of nowhere. It was the final step on a road Abigail had been forced to walk since birth. The plantation house was the heart of power, and for Abigail Turner, it was also the most dangerous place she could be. From the outside, it appeared calm, orderly rooms, measured routines, the quiet confidence of people who believed the world existed for their comfort. Inside, however, it functioned as a space of constant pressure. Every movement was observed, every action judged, every mistake remembered. For enslaved women assigned to domestic work, the house erased any boundary between labor and personal vulnerability. The fields were brutal, but they offered distance. The house offered none. Here, enslaved women were expected to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to be present without drawing attention, to be invisible while standing directly in front of those who owned them. Abigail's daily responsibilities likely revolved around food preparation, cleaning, and service. These tasks placed her in close contact with the plantation family's most private moments. She saw them at their table, heard their conversations, learned their habits. She knew who rose early, who slept late, who drank too much, who lost their temper easily. This knowledge was unavoidable, and in the world of slavery, knowledge itself was dangerous. The kitchen was not a neutral space. It was a site of control. Ingredients were counted. Portions were watched. Timing was strict. If a meal was late, the fault fell on the cook. If it was poorly received, the punishment followed. There was no allowance for fatigue, no room for illness, no forgiveness for error. For Abigail, each day in the kitchen carried the risk of sudden accusation. A stomachache, a spoiled dish, a child's complaint. Any of these could turn suspicion toward her without warning. The enslaved were always assumed to be at fault. Innocence was not a defense, it was an inconvenience. And yet, food was one of the few areas where enslaved women held any influence at all. They touched what others consumed. They handled what sustained life. This reality unsettled slaveholders deeply, even as they depended on it completely. The contradiction was never resolved. Instead, it was enforced through fear. Abigail would have learned quickly that trust in the plantation house was one-sided. She was expected to be loyal, but loyalty offered no protection. She was expected to care for the family's needs, but no one cared for hers. Even compliance did not guarantee safety. Over time, this imbalance eroded something essential. When every day reinforces your powerlessness, when every interaction reminds you that your life belongs to someone else, resentment does not need encouragement. It grows on its own. Abigail's position placed her close enough to observe the hypocrisy at the heart of plantation life. She witnessed comfort built on suffering, meals enjoyed without acknowledgement of the hands that prepared them, moral language spoken by people who benefited from cruelty. This awareness did not make her freer, but it made her more aware of the injustice she lived under. For enslaved women, silence was survival. Complaints could be interpreted as defiance. Questions could be punished. Even visible emotion could be dangerous. So Abigail learned to contain herself, to keep her face neutral, to endure quietly. But silence does not erase feeling. It compresses it. Tension built slowly, not from a single incident, but from repetition, from the knowledge that nothing would change, from the understanding that no matter how well she performed her duties, she would remain vulnerable, replaceable, disposable. The plantation house also meant isolation. Enslaved women working indoors were often separated from others in the quarters. Their schedules differed. Their movements were restricted. Opportunities to speak freely were rare. This isolation deepened dependence on the very people who controlled them. And yet, isolation also sharpened awareness. Abigail had time to think, to reflect, to measure the distance between what was demanded of her and what was denied to her. Each day reinforced the same truth. There was no path within the system that led to safety or dignity. Discipline in the house was swift and personal. Punishments were often public, meant to reinforce authority. They served as warnings to others. Fear was not a byproduct of the system. It was its foundation. Abigail likely saw others punished for small offenses. She likely knew that if suspicion ever settled on her, there would be no meaningful defense. The law would not intervene. Witnesses would not speak. Her word would never outweigh theirs. This knowledge shaped every decision she made. The closer she worked to the family, the more aware she became of the imbalance that defined her life. She served them daily, yet they held the power to destroy her with a single accusation. This was not a relationship, it was domination. When historians later described Abigail as a poisoner, they stripped away this context. They reduced her to an action, divorced from the conditions that produced it. But actions do not occur in isolation. They are responses to environments. By the time illness struck the plantation family, the ground had already been prepared. Years of coercion, fear, and confinement had narrowed Abigail's world until desperation became rational. Whatever her reasons, whatever her intentions, the act that followed did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from the kitchen, from the house, from the daily erosion of autonomy that defined her existence. And when the balance finally tipped, the consequences would extend far beyond that household. Because once the illusion of control was threatened, the system responded with force. It began quietly, as many unsettling things do. A complaint of discomfort, a sudden wave of nausea, a meal that did not sit right. At first, there was no panic, only confusion. Illness was common in the 19th century. Food spoiled easily. Water carried unseen dangers. Stomach ailments were an accepted part of life. But this was different. The symptoms came quickly and with alarming intensity. Pain doubled people over. Vomiting followed. Weakness set in where strength had been moments before. What had begun as mild concerns soon turned into fear as more than one member of the household fell ill. The plantation house, usually controlled and predictable, descended into chaos. Servants rushed. Orders overlapped. Voices rose. The calm authority of the household fractured under uncertainty. Illness does something particular to power. It exposes its fragility. No amount of status or ownership could command a body to recover. As hours passed and conditions worsened, suspicion crept in. This was not a random sickness. The timing was too close. The shared meal too obvious. Attention turned to the food. And once attention turned to the food, it turned inevitably to those who prepared it. The kitchen became a place of tension. Ingredients were questioned. Leftovers examined. Every enslaved person connected to the meal found themselves under silent scrutiny. But suspicion does not spread evenly. It seeks the most vulnerable target. Abigail Turner stood directly in its path. Poison was a feared weapon in the slaveholding imagination. It represented betrayal from within, an attack that could not be easily prevented. Slaveholders told stories of poison to one another, warnings, rumors, exaggerated tales meant to reinforce vigilance. The idea that someone enslaved could quietly strike back unsettled them deeply. As illness continued, fear hardened into certainty. The explanation that preserved their worldview was the most convenient one. This was intentional. Once that conclusion was reached, everything else followed. Abigail's movements were restricted. Her words, already limited, were ignored entirely. She was watched closely, separated. The presumption of guilt did not require proof. It required reassurance. Reassurance that the system still worked. That control could be reasserted. Meanwhile, the sick members of the family suffered. Pain stretched on. Recovery, when it came, was slow and uncertain. Physicians of the era had limited tools and little understanding of toxic substances. Diagnosis relied on observation and assumption rather than certainty. But the conclusion had already been made. This was poisoning. Fear rippled outward from the household to neighboring plantations. News traveled quickly through white social networks. A poisoned family was not just a tragedy, it was a warning. If it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. Conversations shifted. Trust tightened. Surveillance increased. Enslaved kitchens across the region became spaces of heightened suspicion. And at the center of this growing panic was Abigail Turner. She would have understood immediately what this meant. Once accused, there was no returning to her former position. The line had been crossed. The system did not allow for ambiguity where its authority was challenged. Whether Abigail protested or remained silent, the outcome was largely predetermined. Enslaved people did not receive the benefit of the doubt. They received punishment. The illness marked the point of no return. From that moment on, Abigail's identity in the eyes of the plantation was fixed. She was no longer simply a worker. She was a threat. What followed was not an investigation in the modern sense. It was a process of confirmation, of constructing a narrative that restored order and placed blame where it was expected. The question was never truly whether poisoning had occurred. The question was how swiftly the system could respond, and how visibly it could reassert control. For Abigail, the quiet days of survival were over. The machinery of accusation had begun to turn. Accusation under slavery did not begin with evidence. It began with fear. Once fear took hold, it demanded a target, and Abigail Turner fit the role perfectly. She was enslaved. She worked in the kitchen. She had access. That was enough. There was no formal announcement when she became the accused. No reading of charges. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. Her freedom of movement disappeared. She was separated from her usual duties, watched constantly, spoken about as if she were not present. The plantation house closed ranks against her. Confinement under slavery did not require walls or bars. It required authority, a command, a warning, a threat. Abigail's body was already considered property. Restricting it further required no justification. She would have understood the danger she was in. Enslaved people knew how quickly suspicion turned into violence. They had seen it happen to others. A whispered accusation could lead to beatings, sale, or worse. The system did not correct itself, it escalated. Those who controlled the plantation began reconstructing recent events, not to uncover truth, but to validate their conclusion. Every action Abigail had taken was reinterpreted through the lens of guilt. Neutral moments became suspicious. Routine tasks became signs of intent. Silence was read as confession. Speech was read as deception. There was no version of events in which Abigail could clear her name. Her voice held no legal weight. Even if she denied everything, her denial existed only as an obstacle to be overcome. Physical confinement was often paired with psychological pressure, isolation,
threats,
interrogation. Enslaved people were frequently forced to confess to crimes they did not commit, simply to end the suffering. Confessions became tools of closure for those in power, regardless of their truth. Whether Abigail confessed or not, the record would reflect what authorities needed it to reflect. As word spread, local officials became involved. Poisoning was a serious charge, particularly when white lives were affected. The response needed to be visible, severe,
public.
Anything less risked encouraging further acts of resistance. The law entered the picture, but it did not bring balance. Courts in slaveholding states existed to protect white interests. Enslaved defendants were denied basic rights. They could not testify on their own behalf. They could not call witnesses. Their fate was decided by those who benefited from their enslavement. Abigail was now caught between two forces. The plantations need to reassert control, and the legal systems need to make an example. Confinement gave her time to reflect, though reflection offered little comfort. Whatever her original intentions, whether she acted deliberately or was accused unjustly, she now faced a future shaped entirely by others. The accusations stripped away what little stability she had. Even before judgment, punishment had begun. This was how the system functioned. Guilt was assumed. Process existed only to formalize it. Abigail Turner had become a symbol, a warning to others. And symbols were not spared. As preparations moved forward, the outcome grew increasingly inevitable. The machinery of punishment rarely reversed once it started. And Abigail, isolated and powerless, stood alone at its center. When Abigail Turner was brought before the court, the outcome was never in doubt. The proceedings that followed were less a trial and more a ritual, one designed to reaffirm the power of the system rather than uncover the truth. In the legal world of 1838, enslaved people were not considered full persons under the law. They were property, and property could be punished without the protections afforded to citizens. The courtroom itself reflected this imbalance. White men occupied the seats of authority. Judges, lawyers, jurors, all drawn from the same social order that slavery sustained. Their livelihoods, their status, their sense of moral order were bound to the institution Abigail was accused of threatening. Abigail entered this space already condemned. She was not allowed to testify freely. Any statement attributed to her would be filtered through those who recorded it. She could not call witnesses who might speak in her defense. Even if another enslaved person had knowledge relevant to the case, their testimony would not be considered equal to that of a white accuser. Evidence, as understood today, was secondary. Circumstance carried more weight than proof. Access to the kitchen, timing of the illness, fear of poison. These elements formed a narrative that required no further confirmation. Poisoning was viewed as a particularly insidious crime. Unlike physical violence, it challenged the illusion of absolute control. It suggested planning, intelligence, agency. These were qualities slaveholding society refused to acknowledge in enslaved people, except when it served to justify punishment. The prosecution's role was not to question whether Abigail had committed the act, but to present her as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Her humanity was irrelevant. Her past suffering immaterial. The focus remained on restoring order. Abigail's silence, whether chosen or enforced, was interpreted as guilt. Her fear was seen as proof. The legal language used against her stripped away context and complexity, reducing her to a single act. There was no room for questions like why. No space to consider coercion, desperation, or systemic violence. Those ideas challenged the foundation of the court itself. The verdict, when it came, was swift.
Guilty.
The sentence served multiple purposes. It punished the accused. It reassured the community. And it reinforced the boundaries that slavery depended on. Mercy was not part of this equation. For Abigail, the trial marked the final loss of control over her fate. Whatever agency she may have exercised before was now irrelevant. The system had spoken. Outside the courtroom, the message spread. This is what happens when the enslaved defy their place. This is the cost of resistance. And yet, even in this moment of total domination, the system revealed its fear. The severity of the response exposed how threatened it felt. If Abigail truly held no power, such force would not have been necessary. The trial ended, but its implications lingered. It left behind a story shaped by those who recorded it, not those who lived it. And in that gap between record and reality, Abigail Turner's true experience disappeared. What remained was the punishment. The punishment handed down to Abigail Turner was meant to be final, not just for her, but for anyone watching. In slaveholding society, punishment served a purpose beyond justice. It was theater. It was instruction. It was a warning delivered in unmistakable terms. When the sentence was carried out, it was not done quietly. Public punishment reinforced hierarchy. It reminded enslaved communities of the consequences of resistance. It reassured white communities that order had been restored. The spectacle mattered as much as the outcome. For Abigail, the final days would have been marked by isolation and fear. Enslaved people facing severe punishment were often denied comfort. Contact was restricted. The intention was not merely to punish the body, but to break the spirit. What she thought in those final moments is not recorded. History rarely preserves the inner lives of enslaved women. But it is not difficult to imagine the weight she carried. A life defined by control, ending in a moment designed to erase her entirely. The plantation returned to its routines. Fields were worked. Meals were served. The appearance of normalcy resumed.
But something had changed.
Fear lingered. The story of the poisoning spread. It was told and retold, often distorted, always framed to support the existing order. Abigail's name became shorthand for danger, for betrayal, for justification. But beneath the official narrative, another understanding existed. Among the enslaved, the lesson was different. They saw not just punishment, but desperation. They understood what it meant to be pushed beyond endurance. Abigail's story joined a long, unspoken history of resistance, quiet, hidden, but persistent. The system tried to erase her humanity, but it could not erase the conditions that produced her actions. Long after 1838, the legal record remained
Sparse. Cold.
incomplete. It told a story of crime and consequence, but not of suffering and survival. Abigail Turner did not live to tell her own story. Others told it for her. And in doing so, they shaped how she would be remembered. But memory is not fixed. When we look back now, we can see what the court refused to acknowledge. We can see the imbalance of power, the absence of justice, the way fear masqueraded as law. Abigail's act, whatever its exact nature, forced a moment of reckoning. It exposed the vulnerability of a system built on coercion. It revealed that even the most controlled environments could not fully suppress human agency. The punishment ended her life, but it did not end the questions her story raises. Those questions remain. Abigail Turner's name survives in history not because the system wanted it to, but because her actions disrupted the silence slavery depended on. Her story exists in fragments, legal records, second-hand accounts, whispered references, yet those fragments speak volumes about the world she lived in and the forces that shaped her fate. History has often framed people like Abigail as anomalies, as exceptions, as criminals who deviated from an otherwise stable system. But this framing misses the point. Her story was not unusual. What was unusual was that it was recorded at all. Countless enslaved women lived under similar pressures. Many endured. Some resisted quietly. A few reached breaking points that forced the system to respond. Abigail Turner's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It challenges the idea that violence only flowed in one direction. It reveals that resistance did not always take heroic or organized forms. Sometimes, it took the shape of desperation. Her story also exposes the limits of historical records. The voices we hear are those of judges, owners, and officials, not the accused. Abigail's motivations are filtered through hostile eyes. Her fear, her pain, Her reasoning are largely absent. And yet, even within these constraints, meaning emerges. Poison terrified slaveholding society because it inverted power. It allowed the powerless to strike back invisibly. That fear reveals how fragile the system truly was. Slavery depended not only on force, but on belief, the belief that control was total. Abigail's story shattered that illusion. Today, remembering her is not about condoning violence. It is about understanding context. It is about recognizing that morality cannot be separated from circumstance. That choices made under extreme oppression cannot be judged by the standards of freedom. Her legacy is not one of simple guilt or innocence. It is one of complexity, of humanity under pressure, of a system that created the very acts it claimed to fear. When we tell stories like Abigail Turner's, we restore something that was taken from her: recognition. Not as a symbol, but as a person shaped by forces beyond her control. Her life ended in 1838, but the questions her story raises remain urgent. How do systems of power distort justice? How does oppression shape behavior? Who gets to tell history, and who is silenced? Abigail Turner may never speak in her own words, but her story, when told fully, speaks for itself. And it asks us to listen.